Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the basic guide to note length in Cubase. And you already might be thinking, really? Is that really the subject of an entire conversation, the note length in Cubase? Absolutely. In fact, it can be one of the most confusing and daunting areas, certainly for beginners, but even for seasoned veterans in all of Cubase. It's so easy to get really confused with this stuff. We're going to deconstruct it today and figure out what we really mean when we're talking about note length. Hope you enjoy this video today, and if you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. Okay, here we go. We have a piano line, a really simple piano line. I'll play a little bit of it. Nothing special at all. Let's first of all deal with the difference between two of the primary definitions when we're dealing with note lengths. The two words are length and end. If we have a look in the quantize section over on the left hand side in the inspector, you'll see quantize length and quantize ends. We're going to define both of those functions and identify the differences between the two, but just take a moment to think about this. Here we are in the quantize section and we're dealing with the end or the length of notes, depending on which button we're going to press. Why aren't we in the length section? There's an entirely different section down below called length, and that has a completely different set of functions. This is one of the problems when dealing with note length in Cubase. You have these two sections and they're related in a very esoteric way. It's really confusing. I'm going to show you some tips today to kind of mitigate some of those issues, but firstly, let's get back to the definitions. Quantize ends first. I'm going to pick on a single MIDI note, this G2, and we'll zoom in nice and tight so that we can see it really clearly. You see that the end of the note doesn't quite reach to the end of bar 6. Just cycle around that single bar. How do I go about making that note exactly reach the end of the bar? Well, we're dealing with the end of a note. So if we click quantize ends, that's done the job. I'm going to undo that function. I'm doing this via a keyboard shortcut, but I'm basically just undoing these operations each time I want to get back to my start position. Let's try pressing the other button now. What does quantize length do? Well, we're nearly there, but we're not quite. Can you see it's very slightly overhanging the bar? Quantize length deals with the length of the entire note. So basically it's taking it out of the context of the song and it's dealing with it as an independent entity. That note has just been made a particular length. We'll deal with what that length is in a moment. But the important thing is that it's overhanging the end of whatever it's being quantized to by exactly the same amount as this offset at the beginning of the note. I'm going to undo that again. Choosing which of these two functions to execute is a dark science. The basic rule of thumb that you want to use is if you're maintaining a natural groove, you can see that these notes have been played naturally and they're not quantized exactly to the grid. You're generally going to want to quantize ends because tying this point in time over here to this point in time at the beginning of the note really doesn't make very much sense in a musical context. They've got nothing to do with each other. The beginning of the note is really important from the perspective of groove. If I play that single bar, it's got a much more natural feeling to it than if I hard quantize the entire thing. Let's try that. I'll just quantize momentarily. You see all of the notes are now snapped to the beat. It's much more precise, but it's got less groove. Now, the very small differences here between those two, but this stuff matters. And so if I'm maintaining that groove in my song by not quantizing exactly, why would I want to have that exact same amount of offset on the length? In fact, in this particular case, if I quantize length, I'm overhanging the next bar. That might be something that I absolutely don't want to do. So if you have a natural groove, typically you'll use quantize end. If, however, you're quantizing exactly to the beat, just press Q. Now you're totally safe to quantize length because length and end, in the context of a hard quantized piece of music, are identical. I can quantize length now, and you can see that that note's being quantized exactly to the beat. So let's figure out why it's being quantized exactly to the beat. Just undo that again, and I'll undo my master quantize as well. And you see that we have the quantize preset value here, and it's currently set to 1/16. We're also seeing a visual representation of that in the grid. So all of these lines that you're seeing are currently set to the quantize value. If I make that quantize value the smallest it can possibly be, all of these new grid lines appear. So now we're quantizing to 128ths. That's the smallest quantized division that we can select from this preset grid. And now if I select either of these options, we're going to get different behavior. Let's try quantize end first. Can you see it's quantized to the nearest quantized grid line? Let's undo that. Now prepare yourself for a very disappointing experience. I'm going to press quantize length. Watch what happens to this note. So we've just jumped way beyond the 128th line. Let's undo that. Can you see this second option called length quantize? Let's set that to 128th instead. Now I'll perform the quantize length operation, just operating on the G2 here. I'm going to press this button again. Now what's happened is that this note has been quantized to within the length rule in Cubase, not the standard quantize rule. This is why this stuff is so confusing. I think this is just poor. This shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be this difficult to actually get the length of the note that you want. Let's try setting it to a different value. Try 130 seconds. The quantized grid in the background is still the same. So we've got no real visual representation of what we're going to get now. Let's try pressing the button and see what we get. Sure, yeah, okay. I can guess that that probably is a 30-second. Let's clarify that by selecting the grid, the quantized grid behind the scenes. And sure enough, the length of the note has now been quantized so that the offset at the beginning is the same as this overhanging bit at the end. Now this is so confusing that I'm going to make a recommendation to you now that might hopefully make your life much, much easier. In this length quantize box, select quantize link instead. What you're basically doing is disabling the length quantize function completely. Cubase will now utterly ignore this second value. Now, if you're curious as to know why there are two values in the first place, it's because of this mysterious second section down below. We've not really got there yet, so we've not had an opportunity to talk about it. But it is possible to treat the length of notes in two completely different contexts, and you can set different levels of distinction between them. One of the things that you can do with length quantize is specify how long a note will be when you use the pencil tool. So I'll select my pencil tool. I'm just going to click in the grid. That's created a note of 1/32 in length. Let's set the quantize value to 16th. These two values are currently linked together. Click with the pencil tool, and there's the piano note inserted at the correct length. You can basically split those two areas of functionality up and have completely independent control of your own length insert. So here we are with our quantize grid at 116. You can see all the lines in the background, but when I click with my pencil tool, it creates a note according to the length value. Now, because the division between these two functions is so blurred and so confusing, I'm just saying to you, just take all of that trouble out of your life and engage quantize link, and you never have to see this value again. In fact, you can permanently disable it if you really want to go this way. You can take it away from the editor and disable length quantize entirely. All right, then back to our scheduled broadcast. Let's carry on talking about note length. Here we are with our piano chords, and we've now figured out what the difference is between quantize end and quantize length. Here we have our D1, which, as you can see, is starting just after the beginning of the bar. Is there any way for me to make this note extend right up to, but not exceeding, the D1 below? The answer is yes. If I select both of those notes, I'm going to press Control down on my keyboard in order to select that second note. I'm now going to engage a feature called legato. Stretch the first note, basically elongate it until it's right adjacent to the D1 down below. Let's try that. And there we go. And you can see it's now very slightly overhanging. It might coincidentally be the same length as if I'd applied length quantize. That's got nothing to do with it. It's a different conversation. These two notes are now exactly adjacent but not overlapping. Legato is a context feature. If you don't give Cubase any context, if I have no notes selected, I'm going to press apply legato again. Watch this E2. Do you think it's going to go right up to the D1? No, it didn't. Something happened down below. Let's see what. This C1 got longer. What's actually happened there is that Cubase has found the closest note in the entire piece, don't forget it's looking at the entire piano part here. It's basically running along all of these notes one at a time, and it's finding each note that's closest to the next note, and it's stretching that note and only that note. So when I press legato out of context, Cubase is having to make a kind of best guess as to what it thinks I want, and it's stretching this note instead. You can override that default behavior by explicitly selecting a pair of notes, and now it'll apply legato between just those selected notes. Let's apply legato, and there we go, it's done exactly what I wanted it to. That functionality, and this is something again I recommend that you engage permanently, is a feature called extend to next selected. This is the option that's giving us exactly what we want. This is what I want legato to do when I'm writing a piece of music. If that function is disengaged, apply legato just simply doesn't do that thing. It doesn't care what notes you've selected. So as far as I'm concerned, that's an essential function to engage. Now there's a function in Cubase that I don't use. I'm going to introduce you to it, and then we're going to move very swiftly on. It's called scale legato. What it attempts to do is to do this stuff dynamically. I'm going to select these two notes again, apply legato to make them basically adjacent to each other. Now what you're supposed to be able to do with scale legato is to effectively adjust the distance between these two notes. But watch what happens to the end of D1 when I pull the scale back. See, all notes are being scaled equally. That's no use to me. I don't really want that function. And in all honesty, I don't use scale legato. I just don't find it a usable feature. I've never found a use case for it, so I'm not going to recommend that you use it. In fact, if you do use scale legato usefully and you think I'm wrong, please put it in the comments below what you think I'm doing wrong, but I've just basically never found a use for it, as I say. A kind of standalone function in the length section, which is worth having a look at because it can sometimes be useful, is fixed length. So I've just selected 6 notes out of this piano part. I'm going to click fixed length, and it's going to be set to whatever the current quantized value is. Let's see that. Pretty straightforward. Let's undo that, set a different quantized level. Fixed length is now going to set it to that length instead. Down at the bottom of the length section, we've got a couple of features that I use an awful lot. Delete overlaps. We have mono and poly. They serve very different purposes. Delete overlaps mono is interested in a single note. Have a look at these 3 C1 notes down below. Have you ever heard a piano make the same sound twice? You know, it's physically impossible for an acoustic piano to ring the same note twice. You have a hammer hitting a string, that string is going to vibrate. You can't vibrate it twice. So if this note down here was recorded as being that long, let's say you're inserting MIDI notes manually and you've got that kind of business, well, that actually just doesn't make any sense. Now, depending on the settings in your instrument, it might actually play back fine. That's not really the point. What you're doing when you execute delete overlaps mono is you're basically fixing these issues. I select all 3 of those C1 notes and press this button. What it's basically done is truncated the first note so that it's exactly adjacent to but not overlapping the succeeding note. There is no overlap in a mono context, in other words, a single note. Delete overlaps poly is an entirely different idea. What we're dealing with now is multiple notes. This is another really very critically contextual function. You can't just click delete overlaps poly and expect to get away with it. I'm going to zoom out so that we can see this entire piano line. Make sure that I don't have any notes selected, and I'm going to click delete overlaps poly and chaos reigns. You know, that is not what I want to see. Let's undo that. What's happened there is that delete overlaps poly makes sure that no note anywhere is overlapping any other note anywhere. The reason we got all of those tiny notes is because this piano line isn't quantized exactly to the beat. All of these different notes have very, very slightly different start positions. If I zoom in really tight into a single chord, it's actually not even visible. The A2 starts at 119, the F2 starts at 118. They have a different offset. If I'm deleting overlaps in a polyphonic context, it's basically going to make these two 118s one tick long. And that's what's happened when I click delete overlaps. You just get this single tick of information, useless to anyone. Now that doesn't make delete overlaps poly useless. In fact, it's a function that I use an awful lot, generally speaking in the context of solos. So here we have a very simple synth line. Okay, every one of those notes has an attack as part of the sound. When I play a note on the keyboard, you hear that really sharp attack. But if you play legato, you don't get that attack. So if you have overlapping notes, you're going to get a very different kind of sound. Now have a careful look at how that solo's been played. I've actually played it in heavily legato, so all of the notes are overlapping each other. So when I play the synth line, we only hear the attack sound 3 times. There, there, and there. But let's say I actually want a much more staccato sound and I want that attack on every single note. Without delete overlaps poly, I would be left with no option other than to individually edit every one of these notes. And it's important, I should put an asterisk here actually. If you're dealing with a monophonic line like this, then you don't need to be hard quantized. When we were looking at that piano chord, we had 3 notes at almost exactly the same point. That's where you run into trouble with polyphonic overlaps. Here we have a monophonic line, so it really doesn't matter. If I execute this feature now, watch all of these notes get slightly shorter. So now nothing's overlapping. You're going to hear that attack sound on every single played note. Is that what you want? Well, that's an artistic decision. It's not for me to say either way, but it's a completely different sound. That's the important thing. So this is a situation where I've recorded a solo line and I decide I do want the attack on every note. I don't want any overlaps. Delete overlaps poly is my friend, does the job in one single hit. One final thing we're going to have a look at today, and this is kind of a peek behind the scenes at what's really going on. Every now and again when you're recording MIDI in Cubase, you might see something that looks a little bit unusual, because as far as the MIDI protocol is concerned, there's no concept of MIDI length at all. Notes don't have a length. I've added a MIDI monitor insert to this track, and it basically just watches everything that happens as far as MIDI is concerned on this track. If I play a note, can you see it says note on? You can see that it's a C2, and the 59 is the velocity that I hit that note, at which I hit that note. I've still got that key held down as I'm talking to you now. I'm going to let the key go. There's the note off. The difference between those two notes is the length. Now it's actually counting, Cubase is counting in time, so it turned out to be about 13 seconds between those two notes being played. When I press record on this MIDI part, that information is going to get interpreted in Cubase and it will store a single note in the background. Let's try it. There's the note on, there's the note off, and stop recording. Now Cubase has packaged those two MIDI instructions together and generated a MIDI note for me. Cubase has an editor called the list editor. If we open it, you'll see that MIDI note being represented. Here it is. There's a note, there's a start, there's an end, there's a length, C2. The velocity is 79. That's the initial velocity that I hit when I pressed the key. So this first pair was the example note. So I played a 79 velocity C2. You very rarely need to worry about this discrepancy. The fact that the MIDI protocol views MIDI notes as something completely different to Cubase very rarely has an impact. One of them is the curious note off velocity. You see this 115 value. If we select this note, you'll see that we have an off velocity called 115. You don't really ever need to worry about that feature. Note off velocity is extremely uncommon to hear of. It's really not something you need to worry about at all. It's actually a representation of the MIDI protocol behind the scenes. The fact that how hard you press the key and basically how hard that key is being pressed when it's released are two separate pieces of information. If you're somebody who doesn't worry about that stuff, forget it. You just basically pretend I never said anything. But if you're ever kind of curious as to what off velocity is, that's all it is. It's simply a manifestation of the protocol behind the scenes. And with that said, we're done. Hope you enjoyed this video today. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.